Good evening and welcome to everybody. This is the second appointment in 2022 within the cycle of international video conferences on the Zoom platform, all dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Tonight's presentation is coming directly from the USA and is dedicated to PCC tram cars, or streetcars as they say in America. It will be held by Tony Schill from the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. The presentation will be held in English, and you can, at the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English if you want. You can also use the chat in English in every moment during the presentation. I remind you that the complete program of the forthcoming presentation is available, as always, on our internet site in the English section. Thank you. Now, the floor goes now to Mr. Tony Schill. Please, Tony, you can start.
Okay, can you hear me? Give me a little. Okay, fine. Well, good evening, everybody, or whatever time it is where you are. As Roberto mentioned, I'm Tony Schill. I'm retired from public transit in Buffalo and Chicago. And I grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, which, as many of you, I'm sure know, had an extremely large streetcar system and a grand total of 666 PCC cars. And I rode them to high school for 4 years and became a fan and spent many hours riding on the system. My mother told me that when she took me on the cars for the first time in the late 1940s, I would always say, "Hello, Mr. Motorman." So now I am one. Actually, I volunteer at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum as an operator, been a member of that group for some 60 years, actually, believe it or not. And I'm very happy to be able to be here. Roberto saw this, or a version of this program, about a year ago when I put it on for the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. And this is a abbreviated version. The first time around, it went like 3 hours, which is probably a bit much if it's 9 o'clock where you are right now. So let's just get started. And let me say, this is an amateur presentation. I'm working without notes. I've done it a few times. I did it for the Electric Railroaders Association in New York a while back. And it's a pretty broad overview of the subject. So let's just go along and see how it goes. I do want to warn you that there's a couple technical things in this program which I can't seem to figure out. I'm advancing these pictures manually, and once in a while a blank screen will come up, but it is not missing a picture. It's just some kind of timing issue that I didn't have time to figure out. So with that, let's begin. For those of you who are interested in theaters, this happens to be the marquee of the Chicago Theater in Chicago, one of the great preserved theaters of the United States. They were not showing a show about PCCs, I can say that. Well, the PCC has a well-deserved reputation as a early streamlined streetcar. This is a Westinghouse Electric ad. Westinghouse, as you probably know, built the motors for a huge number of the PCCs and the other systems on it. And I always found this ad one day, and I thought it was a pretty neat thing. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. I can't remember ever seeing that in a bus ad, but it may be true. And before we get started, I'd just like to point you guys and ladies to where a lot of information can be found about the PCC cars, far more than I could possibly ever deal with in a little program. And out of the two books on the left by Stephen Carlson and Fred Schneider III, which were done about 30 years ago, probably, and have incredible information about PCCs, as does the third book, which was put up by Seymour Cation and Harry DeMoro. These are probably the best references to the North American PCC that are out there. And they also touch on the foreign versions. So let's go back to the second decade of the, I guess that would be the 20th century. Streetcars, of course, as I'm sure we're all aware, came along as horse cars in the beginning, 1850s, earlier than that in London and some other places. In the 1880s, electrification started to occur, got really rolling around 1890. And in the United States, the little cars that devolved from horse cars soon became much, much bigger. We had a lot of big, heavy cars within 20 years of 1890, within 15 years even. And in time, even though they were great advances technologically, by the 1920s, the electric railway industry in the United States was seeing some problems with ridership. And one of the perceptions was that the streetcars of the time compared poorly in terms of riding quality, aesthetics, whatever you want to call it, to the automobiles and buses that were starting to appear in large numbers. The industry was also concerned that the practice of most large transit systems of designing cars, even if they were built by streetcar builders, not themselves, was largely based on highly specific preferences of each transit system, to the extent that in many cases, you can look at a picture of a car without any notation as to the city it's in or anything like that. And you can tell what city it's in because some cars were so specific in their appearance that you can immediately associate them with a city. But anyway, that specificity and uniqueness contributed to higher capital and operating costs. And that was something that the companies were very conscious of. So by 1929, there were 500 trolley systems in the United States, big and small, 75,000 cars in operation, and 40% of those cars were built 20 years or more earlier. So you can see that there were a lot of old cars in operation. In this view, it's Pittsburgh, about 1920. You have here a big steel car on Route 71, which was Negley Avenue, pulling a trailer, a low floor trailer, and behind there was a low floor motor car. The low floor motor car was probably the biggest single advance, arguably, in American electric railway practice. Pittsburgh decided that it wanted to have low floor cars to ease boarding and the lighting. And they worked with Westinghouse to develop what we called baby motors that enabled the wheel diameter to be reduced from the standard of the time, which was about 33 inches, down to about 24, 25 inches. And this allowed the floor to come down, which made it much easier to get in and out of the cars. This is Pittsburgh about 1920. We have open cars still in operation. This was really toward the end of open car operation in Pittsburgh. And down further is a high floor steel car and one of the new low floors. Pretty much the automobile is yet to appear here, but within a few years, they were dominating the streets. I tend to favor pictures of Pittsburgh for illustration just because I'm from Pittsburgh. Along came the bus. Here we are about in the late 1920s. Passengers had the choice of riding a streetcar built 30 years or so before, or in a brand new bus with leather seats. And unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, a lot of them chose the bus. It's a little bit later. This is a yellow coach, I believe, and it's the first time that the bus of the type used today, the motor in the back or under the floor, came along. And once these large buses, which they considered competitors to streetcars, came, they became even more important to come up with a modern streetcar. Another scene, this is in, I believe, in Seattle, showing how streetcars came to be troubled by the number of automobiles. So about 1929, this was more or less a typical American streetcar. This is a Peter Witt, built right at the end of the 1920s for Detroit. And it's a modern car in comparison with the older cars it replaced, but it didn't really give the same level of comfort and riding quality and so on that people were expecting after having experienced automobiles and buses. It wasn't as if the streetcar industry was unaware of the need to change. The first big product of the 1920s was the Birney safety car, which allowed rapid conversion to one-man operation. Instead of having a motorman and a conductor, they could just have an operator. But the Birney car was no improvement in terms of ride quality. They were bouncy. They were great for the economics of providing the transportation, but not so much an improvement in terms of riding quality. Other efforts of the time were Cincinnati curved sidecars. This is one of the very first that was built. A modernized single axle car, single truck car that St. Louis produced for Grand Rapids, I believe. Lots of attempts to make the streetcar more modern in appearance. Even the bus people got in. This is a twin coach car built by a company that primarily produced motor buses and did until relatively recently. But these smaller cars weren't the answer. They needed big cars. Pittsburgh in 1929 and 28 and 29 bought 3 experimental cars. They broke the ice in Pittsburgh in terms of getting modern cars, but they weren't very popular with the company, and they only lasted a decade before they were cut up. But they helped get the way going. Another advanced car of the time was the Pink Lady, a Brill car that served as the forerunner of the Brill Master Unit, which was extremely popular after 1930, although not in the huge numbers that were needed to make a big dent in the old car problem. Even Detroit had a single truck car that they rebuilt in their shops called the Blue Streak. So this is about 1930, sometime in the early 1930s. The transit industry still does, but not with so many streetcars, have an annual convention where equipment is displayed. And this is, I believe, in Cleveland. And you can see a lot of lightweight cars, trolley bus, and so on. So this is the direction the industry was going, but not very fast. And the private companies that constituted the bulk of the transit industry in the United States realized something more had to be done. So they formed a committee called the President's Conference Committee. Remember, these were all private companies for the most part, with stockholders and a president at the head of each. And they created a committee which was intended to work towards the production and implementation of a new modern streetcar. It was led by Dr. Thomas Conway Jr., who was a very respected transit expert who had run other transit systems, modernized other transit systems. In particular, he was responsible for the bullet cars built for the Philadelphia and Western by Brill in the very early 1930s. And also he saved the Cincinnati and Lake Erie by bringing more modern equipment on. That was an interurban that ran in Ohio. Assisting him was Dr. Clarence Hirschfield, who was very experienced in the conducting of major research and engineering projects. And he was not a railroad or a transit person. He had come from the Detroit Edison Company, which was a electric power company in Detroit. The object was to recruit members from the industry, both transit systems and the industrial companies that supplied the industry, with a 3-year program funded by the members to create a new streetcar. And when it was built, they would sell the cars under license and with a fee applied to the sale of each car that would then be dedicated to ongoing research for continuous improvement. So what did they want? They wanted to use the systems engineering approach rather than trying to improve things in a vacuum, like the motor or the suspension or the heating, whatever. They wanted it all to be done as part of an overall system, a pretty common approach to engineering today, but not so much back then. So they also wanted a standardized design with limited options in order to reduce the purchase or construction and operating costs. It had to have maximum passenger appeal, improved riding qualities, modern styling inside and out, and very importantly, rapid and smooth acceleration and braking. Those of you who have ridden in old cars with K control or any kind of the older controls know that there are jerks associated with advancing the controller, brakes grab, all kinds of things that contribute to an uncomfortable ride. Along with that goes minimizing noise and vibration. Most old cars had spur gearing, and that's about as noisy a gearing arrangement as you can have. When we run cars at the museum, people want to know what all the noise is. Well, it's an air compressor and it's the gearing. And of course, improved heating and ventilation. They had already come a long way from having stoves in cars with heated by coal, but it still had a long way to go. So what happened was the Transit Research Corporation, first the Electric Railway President's Conference Committee, later Transit Research, did an entire survey of all the modern, what were considered to be modern streetcars then in operation in the United States. And out of those hundreds and hundreds of cars, they picked 4 cars to be used for actual intensive research in Brooklyn, where they had a test track and a building they could use for experimental purposes. And these cars were from left in clockwise from left top. They were all Peter Witt's, front entrance, center action, center entrance, with the top left being from New York City, on the right top, Chicago. Right bottom is another New York City car, but this is kind of an oddball because it had been built by Twin Coach, a one-of-a-kind car that had some experimental features that they thought could be useful in the PCC program. And finally, a Baltimore Peter Witt. These were all modern cars, and they were all Peter Witts, which kind of gave you an idea where they were going in terms of car design. And here's the Twin Coach car. This is after it had been was no longer being used by the President's Conference Committee. It's just a view of the car in service in New York. Did all kinds of testing, noise and vibration, acceleration, braking. It was quite a research program, and it went on for a couple years before they felt they could proceed with building a car. And that car was the PCC Model B. It was built by a Pullman Standard Company and incorporated many of the features that showed up later in the production PCC cars. It had one curious feature. Part of the braking system, it was an eddy current braking system, which only worked when the trolley pole was in contact with the wire. And The car was involved in an accident. The pole came off the wire and it was unable to stop before colliding with something. So that was the end of the eddy current braking system. This is the interior of that car. You can see that this is a huge change in the passenger experience from the typical heavyweight streetcar that preceded it. Two other cars were built that incorporated some of the results of the PCC research program. One was built by Brill and one was built by Pullman. This is the Pullman, and they were ordered by Chicago Surface Lines, which was one of the, if not the largest streetcar system under single management in the United States. And they came at a time when the research program was still in progress. Excuse me. This is the Brill version. It looks a little bit more like a PCC car than the Pullman car did. These cars survived many years, and they ended up at a CTA car barn, later a bus garage, as storage sheds in South Side Chicago. The other thing that happened was that as the program proceeded, 20 cars were built for DC Transit, Capital Transit at the time in Washington, DC. 10 were built by Brill and 10 were built by St. Louis. This is a Brill car on Brill trucks. You notice the pole is down. Of course, Washington was one of the cities that had conduit current collection. And this is the St. Louis version that they operated. These cars survived, and at least as a museum piece, until the end of streetcar service in Washington in 1962. So let's go to the actual PCC itself. The pre-war design was a little bit different than the post-war design. They did a lot of work in creating the design. This is a stated 1937, but this is the body design patent that was submitted by a gentleman named Dan Bell on behalf of the Electric Railways President's Conference Committee. Dan Bell was an engineer with the Pittsburg Railways Company. And this is the basic body design for all of the pre-war cars, except of course for modifications we'll talk about later. They did a mock-up. St. Louis Car Company was chosen to build the mock-up. And when the first car was done, quite a bit of attention was given to it in ads in the press. Here is a young lady noting how quiet the operation of the car was. There is and the reason it was so quiet was that the trucks had two features. There were rubber in the springs. There was rubber in the springs, which you can see where those spring bellows are. And the wheels are resilient. This is the first big use of resilient wheels, where there is rubber in the wheel, and it's the wheel is constructed. It's not solid. It's basically bolted together, and there is no direct metal to metal contact all the way down to the track. Here you see that little wire. That is a shunt that provides a path for the current returning to the powerhouse through the track. Without that, there's no metal to metal path through the wheel. And a big source of noise, as I mentioned before, was the gearing. Now, this is a New Orleans car, the type that is still running in New Orleans, but it's very common in American streetcars up until the PCC. There were some tests of other types of gearing, but by and large, 90% or more of the streetcars had spur gears. Spur gear is the pinion gear, which you see right down here, and then the axle gear it's simply straight tooth gears meshing with each other. And it's it's about the noisiest kind of gear arrangement you can have. Instead, the PCC had hypoid gearing, where there was a drive shaft, and these helical grooves permitted better contact. Several of the grooves on the pinion gear were in contact with several grooves on the ring gear, and the whole operation, you can see the grooves are curved, was extremely quiet. And to some extent, it's based on automotive practice, which also has a lot of hypoid gearing. So this is an overview of a PCC truck as built. The motors are in yellow. The blue is the drive shaft. Here's the motor that drives this gear case for this axle. And this, of course, the gear case. These are the springs in the brown, the wheels. And this happens not to show the brakes, but you'll see how the original brakes worked. Just a second, get out of that. This is a Clark B2 truck, which was the most common of the PCC trucks. This has tread brakes right here. Later on, most PCCs had drum brakes where the brake was on the drive shafts, and this was possible to eliminate the tread brakes, which contributed a lot to the more quiet ride and less maintenance requirements, because all its parts move naturally, and the source of and then, of course, later they went to electric brakes. These are air brakes. This is what St. Louis Car Company, car orders under construction. Now, just looking at this, you can see it's a Westinghouse car, Westinghouse motor and accelerator. This circular device here is the accelerator. And I'll show you another picture. A GE car a General Electric car would have a different type of accelerator, but all this was under the car. Of course, the box cover has been removed for this view. And this is the source, primary source of how the car was made to accelerate smoothly and to brake smoothly. So this is a Westinghouse accelerator. Half of it is braking contactors. The other half is the accelerating contactors. So where a typical old streetcar might have 8 points of acceleration, this car had many, many, many more points. And the way this worked is a pilot motor drove this device, which rotated depending, and when it rotated, it pushed the contacts, which completed the circuit. And they were all arranged to, as you applied more power, to push the contacts, which gave allowed more current to flow. But it didn't jerk. It was extremely smooth. And the braking system worked the same way. Now, the Westinghouse was different than the General Electric controller, which you see here on the right. In some respects, the General Electric controller, which was a cam controller, was better. The problem with the GE controller was the accelerator is that it had to be removed from the car to be worked on. Whereas the Westinghouse, all you had to do was drop the cover from under the accelerator, and on a pit you could get underneath and do the work on the controller. As a result, I think I'm not really sure whether GE or Westinghouse had more motors. I know in Pittsburgh the practice was to buy 75% of each order with Westinghouse and 25% with GE. Okay, let's move along. PCC cars, the air cars, before the all-electric, had air compressors, but you did not hear them chugging along as they did on an older car. They had very quiet, much smaller air compressors with two-stroke or two piston assemblies that pumped up the air. And that is on the top left is an air brake from one of the present Boston PCCs, air brake compressor. Appearance is a big deal, you know, as we can see with the cars being produced today, that most of the recent light rail cars have lots of curves and so on, which, at least in my opinion, provide a nice looking vehicle. The PCC, of course, was made out of metal and had a number of very hard to create compound curve ends. Later, some cars, especially the St. Louis cars, were a little more curvy than the Pullman standard PCCs. And in later years, some systems simply, Pittsburgh in particular, created front ends that did not have all the compound curves. Now, when they started working with plastics and composites, it became a lot easier to do those curves. I'm thinking this is a Philadelphia order around 1940. Gives you an idea on the left of what's underneath a PCC car in terms of frame. And on the right, it's car 100, which was the first Pittsburgh PCC, showing the operator's controls from left to right. You have the dead man pedal, the brake pedal, and the accelerator. The lever is a handbrake, and the ball lever under the seat is, in effect, the reverser key. Push it forward to go forward, bring it backward. It's in the neutral position. The handle can only be removed when it's in the neutral position. The dead man basically has to be depressed at all times that the car is in motion. Otherwise, the brakes will be applied. Heating and ventilation was a big improvement over the old arrangement in the PCC. The car's structure provided for ductwork that went from the resistor heaters and the blowers up around the top of the car, and with outlets along the floor and in the roof. Early Philadelphia car. Now, even though the PCC was pretty much a standardized car, it was possible to order a lot of individual variations that didn't really affect too much how the car had to be constructed. Different seating arrangements, obviously different colors. You know, in some cases, there were changes to cars that did require a fair amount of extra work. This is the first Pittsburgh car. They had mohair seats, later leather. And you could either get the lift windows, automobile crank type windows, or later the lift windows. Passenger had to lift with two fixtures on the side. So the first cars came out in 1936. The first went to Brooklyn, the second went to Pittsburgh, and the third went to Boston. This is the first car for Brooklyn. This is just out of the factory. It would soon have the headlight wings applied, which you'll see in another photograph here. The painting done by General Electric for a little booklet I have on the PCC car. This was quite the fancy thing in 1936. And Pittsburgh's first car, which was built as part of the same order as the Brooklyn car, with slight variations. In particular, the Brooklyn car had a double sign. Pittsburgh car had a one roller sign, and it did not have the light above the headlight, the car following light. And the Boston first car, very much like a Brooklyn car. So those came out in 1936, and a ton of orders came in pretty quickly. Chicago bought 83, Pittsburgh almost immediately ordered another 100, followed by another 100. Philadelphia. Letter from the president of the Pittsburgh Railways, the vice president, general manager, it was in bankruptcy at the time, about how happy they were with the PCC. Toronto. This particular car is kind of neat. It's St. Louis Streamliner, and it meant St. Louis Car Company Streamliner, but it so happens that this car was built for the St. Louis Public Service Company. And we'll talk about it in a minute, because it was the first of the really unique PCCs in terms of the pre-war production. Show a little leg there, always popular. So the first 10 years of the PCC are shown here, and each line shows the incremental change from the previous year. You can see how popular things were. Then they tailed off during the war, because there was not that much of an increase from year to year during the war. And in 1945, when the war was coming to a close, all kinds of orders got placed. Altogether, there were about 5,000 PCC streetcars built. So the post-war production was, about 1,500 or so cars. And the post-war car made a number of improvements. One was all electric operation, got rid of the air systems, totally all electric, and standee windows, new front end, new back end. The front end went to a slanted windshield design to reduce glare that was interfered with the operator's view of the tracks ahead. That required the front end to be pushed out a few inches, which produced a more pleasing curve to the front of the dash area there below the windshield. Now we're stuck here. Let me see what I can do. This is one little oddity, which I purposely did not mention until now. All but one PCC car was built by either St. Louis Car or Pullman Standard. St. Louis with a plant in St. Louis, and Pullman Standard had a plant in Worcester, Massachusetts. The exception was Clark Equipment Company in Michigan built one car as more or less as an experiment, and it was aluminum, and it had features that would later show up in the PCC design, in particular standee windows. This car had a fairly distinctive front end that was later modified following an accident, ended up having a regular standard PCC front end, and it ran, it still exists. It's in one of the trolley museums. It ran for Brooklyn and Queens Transit right up until the end of their streetcar operation. One property that was very progressive, more so than most, was St. Louis Public Service. Now, these two cars look different. but they're actually the same model of car. St. Louis put the post-war front end on its cars as early as 1940. And they also had the first all-electric cars long before anybody else. And what you see here on the right is a car where they have covered up the windows. The car has, both cars have the same kind of windows, but the one on the right has cardboard covering the windows to show what standee windows and smaller Bain windows would look like. And this actually led to the purchase of cars by St. Louis with this window design and front end. Meanwhile, back at the factory, work continued in 1945 on a new car style for the post-war years. Started out with a kind of oddities here that never actually made it into final production. What was produced was this car for Pittsburgh, which was the first post-war all-electric car. It's the only car Pittsburgh had with this window arrangement and ventilating arrangement. The later cars had ventilators on the roof, but not as prominent as this one. This car was not popular. Transit systems tend not to like individual cars that are different from all the other cars because there are problems for maintenance and procurement. This car only lasted about 10 years. It burned in the Homewood car barn fire of 1955. But a whole new wave of publicity went out when the post-war car came out. The method of construction was about the same. You can see that there's quite a bit of slant to that windshield. Philadelphia cars under construction. Who knows? Maybe one of these cars is in San Francisco today. Chicago bought cars different than anybody else's. They experimented with the door arrangement to an unprecedented degree. This is one of the versions Chicago did of doors. They were also the longest PCCs. The last order for Pittsburgh in 1948. These were interurban PCCs. They ran on very long lines from downtown out to 35 miles to Charleroi and 29 miles to Washington. They truly were interurban PCCs. And this is an example of the very last order of PCCs built, the 1000 series for San Francisco Municipal Railway. After that, there were no more. Okay, now let me go back here. Things are getting out of control here. All right, just a minute, folks. Yeah, we want to go back though. Previous. Okay. So this is a little map that shows every North American property that bought a PCC car, either new or used, between 1936 and 1960. Some of these cities, for example, El Paso, bought cars elsewhere from San Diego. And of course, there's other examples. Dallas's cars ended up in Boston. We're going to go look very quickly through some of the PCCs that ran in the United States. Baltimore, the St. Louis car, which was the first 20 cars or so from in Baltimore were from St. Louis, but the other 250 plus cars were from Pullman. This is a Pullman car in Baltimore. You notice it has a little less styling flourishes than the St. Louis car. This is a Birmingham post-war Pullman. Birmingham had a small number of cars. It was run by the power company. When the power company had to sell the transit system, the city took it over, repainted it. These cars eventually went to Toronto. If you remember the Boston car I showed you earlier, it was 3001. Here's the 3002 at the Riverside Car House on the converted railroad commuter line that was put in the 1960s. I took this one myself in 1965. They also had all electrics, about 25 all electrics in Boston. They weren't too popular, and they were followed by the next picture, not this one. These are ex-Dallas double N PCCs in Boston. Probably the most modern looking PCC car was the final order for Boston about 1951. This was the next to the last order of PCCs built in the United States. These are called the picture window cars for obvious reasons. There's a door on the left because of loading in the subway had to be done on that side. Interestingly enough, these cars were not all electric. They're among the very few cars built after the war that had air brakes. Chicago, 683 cars, the largest fleet in the United States, and the largest fleet in North America, second to Toronto. But many of Toronto's cars were bought secondhand. Chicago's were all bought new. These are the 1936 cars. And after the war, 600 cars were built for Chicago. They had all been ordered by the predecessor to the Chicago Transit Authority, the Chicago Surface Lines streetcar operation. Once the CTA came in 1947, they had an entirely different outlook on life and wanted to focus on replacing subway elevated cars, many of which were still wood from the early part of the century. And they really didn't want 600 brand new streetcars, but they couldn't cancel the contract. So they took delivery and then set about finding a way to turn the streetcars into rapid transit cars. And some experiments were carried out with a couple cars to see to what extent they could be converted to high floor subway elevated cars. What ended up happening was the structure of the streetcar was inadequate for train service, and there were issues with floor height. So I'll just go to the next slide. Sorry. All the cars ended up in a scrapyard and were cut up. The bodies were cut up, but the trucks and the motors and the controls, the windows, the seats were all saved and incorporated into rapid transit cars. So you're looking here at a pile of cars that are less than 10 years old. Now I'll go back because I screwed up. Here's two Chicago cars passing. The area between the inner rails of each track, in the United States at least, is typically called the Devil Strip. The Chicago cars were pretty wide. The Devil Strip wasn't wide enough for them to pass each other. So these cars were constructed with a 3-inch offset towards the outside of the track on the kingpins in order to allow them to pass safely on double track. They also had an oddity in Chicago, hand control on a PCC car. Looking at the picture on the left, the handle at the top is most distant is the track brake, then the controller, and closest to us is the control for the brake. These cars, after they were built as 2-man, so the operator didn't need to use his hands for making change or dealing directly with the passengers. The conductor took care of all that. When they were turned into one man, the hand controls were removed and the regular pedals were put in. And here's just an example of a PCC rapid transit car. These particular cars in this picture on the left were not made from streetcars, but all subsequent orders were. And Pittsburgh eventually, Chicago eventually had well over 600 PCC rapid transit cars. You saw that one. Cincinnati had relatively small, I think 75 cars. This is a demonstrator that came from Pullman Standard in the late 1930s. Also another demonstrator that came from St. Louis. Ultimately, they had both pre-war and post-war cars. All their post-war cars and some of the pre-war cars as well went to Toronto eventually. Cleveland Transit. These cars went to Toronto, and a couple of them actually came back to Cleveland for a brief period before the modern light rail cars arrived. These are also Cleveland cars, but this one is from Louisville. Louisville had an interesting situation. The management ordered about 25 cars, and before they were delivered, new management decided they didn't want streetcars. So not even all the cars had been delivered, and they were all sold without ever running in Louisville to Cleveland. Dallas double enders. As I said, these cars have gone to Boston. First PCC in Detroit was diverted from an order for Pittsburgh. So it was delivered to Detroit in the Pittsburgh paint scheme. This was the only pre-war PCC in Detroit. Most of their cars were post-war models. El Paso got its cars from San Diego. We're going alphabetically here, by the way. Got cars from San Diego. These were very old cars built in the 1930s. As you may know, lately, several of them have been rebuilt and are now running on a heritage trolley line in downtown El Paso. Also El Paso. I didn't get to see El Paso run. I got there a week too late. In 1973, the El Paso transit system at that time owned the bridges connecting El Paso and Juarez, New Mexico, and the trolley line was a loop between Mexico and the United States. The trolley company decided it wasn't really worth it to collect tolls. The tolls being collected weren't enough to offset the wages. So they stopped collecting tolls on the bridges and laid off all the workers. Workers didn't really care for that. So they kidnapped a streetcar on its last trip through Juarez and held it there for a couple of weeks until they got some kind of satisfaction from the trolley company. The line never did resume operating to Juarez. Johnstown, smallest city in the U.S. with PCCs. Johnstown, a steel city, kind of a miniature Pittsburgh, had 17 PCCs. Big operation in Kansas City. This is another example of order it the way you want it. This is a post-war car, but it does not have standee windows. That's because the president of the Kansas City Public Service Company did not like standee windows. So for that reason, all the Kansas City PCCs were built without them. Now we go to California. First order for Los Angeles in the late 1930s. Of course, Los Angeles also had the Pacific Electric Railway. In 1940, they bought 25 double-end cars for use on primarily eventually on the Glendale-Burbank line. That tunnel is actually the subway that leads into downtown Los Angeles, where there was an underground terminal in the subway terminal building. Tunnel's still there, partly. Part of it's been excavated away, but and it's not really usable anymore, but it's still there. This is a really unusual condition for the United States, not so much in Europe, but here we have a standard gauge PCC on the Pacific Electric, and right behind it is a narrow 3-foot-6-inch gauge PCC on Los Angeles transit lines. We mentioned Louisville already, so I'll skip that. Actually, it wasn't a half bad paint scheme. Minneapolis. This particular car is another example of a car being diverted from a Pittsburgh order as a demonstrator, which they kept. This car eventually ended up in Mexico City. The owned cars were all standard post-war types. Except, well, now we're in Mexico City. This is in 1974. And this 2000 was built new for Mexico City. It's the only new PCC that was delivered to Mexico. All the rest were secondhand, primarily from Detroit and I think Minneapolis. This is a Detroit car in Mexico City. Montreal had 18 cars, noted for the absence of headlights. And the Newark City subway, which still operates, but with modern equipment, all former Minneapolis cars. This was built in the bed of an abandoned canal. Here's that same Clark Equipment PCC in Brooklyn. See what the back end looked like. Here is one of Brooklyn's own St. Louis cars. This is late in its life. Originally, they were delivered in a rather bilious brown color, just an opinion. Philadelphia is one of the cities with a huge number of cars, 580, starting in 1938 with this order here. This is part of the final type of fleet of the post-war cars. Pittsburgh, here's car 100, which was the first delivered in 1936. Pittsburgh Railways took all its historical record car photos at the same location right here near the Homewood Car House. Downtown PCCs and a low floor car ahead. Streetcars survived in Pittsburgh in large numbers well into the 1960s. Here's that 1600. That's the one, the all-electric, first post-war all-electric car we saw earlier. Mentioned that one line went to Charleroi. It was pretty bucolic scenery, street running in intermediate towns, but otherwise all private right-of-way. Went over many high bridges. Some of you may have heard of Harold Geisenheimer. He was a rail fan who was head of the Port Authority of Allegheny County, successor to Pittsburgh Railways. In the early 1970s, he pushed through a painting program that really was pretty unprecedented at that time in the industry, taking all the old cars, which looked pretty bad by that time, and painted them in different colors. Many were made into advertising cars. The best one of the whole bunch is that rainbow-shaped striped car. That was Trolley. That's what it says on it, Trolley. And towards the end of PCC operation, Pittsburgh built in its own shops about a dozen PCC look-alike cars. This is one of them when it came out of the shops in 1989. Body has got rivets on it because unlike a regular PCC, this one was made, the body panels were made from a composite that could not be welded. So it has rivets. St. Louis, first order of all electric cars, 1940. And the second order, the 1600s and later the 1700s, where they have standy windows, but these are and slant windshields, but these are actually pre-war cars. St. Louis also had an oddball control system. In this one, the brake is on the right and the accelerator is on the left. Those half pedals are the dead man. And this was totally different from all other PCC cars. And so PCCs from St. Louis, some were sold to other cities, but in general, with this arrangement, they weren't too popular. Some were eventually changed over to the standard arrangement once they were sold to other cities. 8 cars were owned by Illinois Terminal, used on the suburban line from St. Louis to Granite City across the Mississippi River. You may know the Illinois Terminal was a very large interurban line that lasted into the 1950s, hundreds of miles of track through Illinois, and they had a couple of very nice streamliners, not PCCs, but streamliners that escaped preservation, let me put it that way. This is San Diego. This car may be in El Paso today. Getting close now to San Francisco. First 10 cars came in the first PCCs came around the end of World War II, I believe, or maybe before. Those were these double end cars called torpedoes, later made single end. Some of them survive now on the Market Street Railway. This is a former St. Louis car in San Francisco. This is the last PCC built new in North America by a car builder, the 1040, and it runs today in San Francisco. Shaker Heights mostly started with an order of Pullman doors with cars with left side doors, never utilized for that purpose. And then it bought many cars. This one from St. Louis Public Service, and then this one from Minneapolis. A lot of secondhand movement. Tampico, everybody's favorite, 44 cars. Here's a Kansas City car in Tampico. It looks pretty good. And here's one from St. Louis that doesn't look so good. Tampico was a rolling junkyard at the end. Toronto, 745 PCCs, about 500 and some were built new for Toronto. This is the first order. One of the few cities to run multiple unit PCCs. Vancouver had a small number of cars built in the 1930s. Washington, D.C., of course, conduit operation. The Silver Sightseer car converted to be a sightseeing tour car. It survived the end of service, but unfortunately, it went to a trolley museum and eventually was in an arson fire, kind of wrecked it. Just a little bit overseas, many of you are probably familiar with the St. Louis PCC car shipped to Brussels. It was a pretty neat idea, and the car itself wasn't very popular. It was way too big for European clearances, but it led the way to a lot of European PCCs from Belgium. Here's one of them that's made it down to Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Of course, Den Haag, this is the last day of operation of PCCs there. You know, to varying degrees, they're all a little bit different. Over a period of time, they became less North American in their appearance. And this is for you guys in Turin, one of the Fiat PCCs. And Madrid. Now, not all of these are necessarily actual PCCs, some that wouldn't necessarily meet the definition of a PCC having a license from the Transit Research Corporation. But so far, I think all of these do. This one I don't think did. I took this in Rome in 1987. Poland. Melbourne. Only a PCC in Australia. The Hamburg PCC. Stockholm. Saint Etienne in France. Tokyo. And of course, the top famous Tatra cars. These are in Riga a few years ago. And Moscow. I'm glad I was able to get to Europe when there were still lots of them running. Prague. Cairo, didn't get there. Or Alexandria, maybe, and this is Cairo. Los Angeles car. Washington PCCs converted to articulated format in Sarajevo. Barcelona. Washington car. And there's Pacific Electric cars running in Buenos Aires, converted to third rail. Also converted some to non-driving motors with pass-throughs at the ends. One car made it down to Costa Rica. It was dieselized. And quite a few Los Angeles cars went down to Chile for service at mining operations. On the upper left's a Johnstown car after the closure in 1960, being stripped for parts, which went into the order shown on the right for Brussels, survived till pretty recently in Brussels. The where are we? I'm doing all right. This is a magic carpet car. Looks like a PCC, shares many of the characteristics of a PCC, but technically was not a PCC. The city of San Francisco bought 5 of these cars in 1939, but was unable by law to pay royalties to the Transit Research Corporation. So they're technically not PCCs. They had different control systems. You see here what's called a Siniston control instead of the typical PCC controller. And some of them had Brill trucks, some of them had St. Louis PCC trucks, but they're not considered PCCs. Nor are these cars that ran for the Philadelphia Suburban Transportation. Again, PCC components, but not PCCs. One of the oddities was Car 100 in Pittsburgh. In 1950, it was converted to an instruction car. I don't have an interior view of the car, but basically a hole was cut in the floor above the accelerator, that big rotating accelerator, and it was glassed over, and aspiring motorman could see what happened when the pedal was pushed, what happened underneath the car. One car in Pittsburgh was made into a snowplow, spectacularly unsuccessful. It was way too light and derailed all the time. We have the Fort Worth Leonard's Department Store subway. A bunch of ex-Washington PCCs were sent down to Fort Worth, made into high floor loading PCCs, double-ended, and they ran it from a parking lot into a very short subway into the basement of a department store owned by the Leonard's brothers. It ran for a long time. This is a Pittsburgh 1600 PCC converted due to an accident with a new front end. Boston work car PCC. Toronto made PCCs into rail grinding cars. Once upon a time, when the Pacific Electric, then Los Angeles Metropolitan Transit Authority line to Long Beach was getting toward the end of its run, a car was two trucks were shipped down from San Francisco, standard gauge trucks, and put underneath the Los Angeles PCC. And this was floated as a possible replacement for the type of cars on the left known locally as blimps, because they were so big. It didn't end up well. One Washington car went up to General Electric in Erie, Pennsylvania for the use in train control experimentation. And another one was used for the same purpose by Westinghouse Air Brake in Pittsburgh. This one is now in the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum collection. And most ended up something like this or worse. Here is a 1600 in Pittsburgh passing by some earlier generation cars being cut up and hauled away. And here we have one more view of the M11, the very second PCC to be built, but reportedly the first to actually operate in revenue service way back in 1936, converted to an instruction car, and then for several years it rusted in peace right here at the South Hills Junction Yard. Unfortunately, this car was not preserved. It's very, very unfortunate that it wasn't. PCC has been revived, as I'm sure you all know. Boston still runs PCCs with trolley poles, a very small number on the Mattapan-Ashmont high-speed line. Philadelphia does the same. These cars are PCC2s, have air conditioning and other modern components, actually are now being rebuilt once again into PCC3s. They're pretty much the same as what you see here. Not too many cars, handful of cars. A former Philadelphia PCC running as a tourist tram in San Diego, California. Bunch of Toronto cars repainted for various different operations in the United States, running in Kenosha, Wisconsin on a very short quasi-tourist line in downtown. Here's one of those El Paso cars from 1937, built for San Diego, ran in El Paso, sat in the graveyard for years and years and years, and recently it's been rebuilt for service by Brookville Car Company. And technically, this is a transit system in service. It's the McKinney Avenue Transit Authority in Dallas, has a museum line, but it runs on a schedule and collects a fare. It's intermittent stops, just like a regular streetcar route. So it counts as an operating line with PCCs. And finally, we have here the 1040, which I showed you before as the last PCC built. This is how it looks today, running on the extremely popular Market Street Railway in San Francisco. That's it. We are done. Thank you.